If there's one thing I'd have to choose on what Romania gets right on policy, I'd have to say it's the policy on abortion. It's restrictive enough not to provide obvious ammunition to the anti-abortion crowd, and it's also liberal enough to cover the, how should I call them, less objectionable cases? Yeah, let's leave it like that, less objectionable, because abortion is objectionable in any event. I mean, it is killing. It is, seriously. But the practice of 22 years of banned abortion under communism and the practice of having the most liberal law possible in Europe on abortion for another 20 years, also under communism, that would be in the 50s, have led to a much more sensible compromise or a trade-off in Romanian policy than a significant chunk of Europe, and definitely a better trade-off than the United States. If there's anything I would change to the current law, it would be the total removal of state funding for abortion, because if it is your choice, then it must be your responsibility as well, and perhaps I would lower the limit from 14 weeks, which is now, to 12 weeks, like it is the case in France or Denmark. But over the long run, especially as technology progresses, the limits of abortion will have to go lower and lower, for the simple reason that artificial wombs will render moot the my body argument, and sooner or later it's going to be possible to just come to say, oh, you don't want to take the pregnancy to the term? Fine. Here's a nice little piece of technology that will do it for you. Sorry, cupcake, killing is no longer an option. And it is for these reasons, and others that we will discuss soon, that the so-called pro-choicers, which is a misnomer really, will eventually lose the moral argument. Maybe it will take 50 years, but they will lose this one if they don't get their act together. And they don't seem to even want to consider doing so. And that's why pro-choicers suck. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative, and in yet another video that is very difficult for me to make, but that needs to be made because nonetheless I haven't found my position stated anywhere else, so yeah. So, as I was saying in the intro, the pro-choicers suck. And they suck big time because they've gotten too lazy and they've gotten very dogmatic about their position, and when that happens, defeat is very close. Anyway, as many of you may know, 400,000 or 450,000 Polish people signed a petition and kickstarted a citizens' initiative in Poland to get a law passed that would further restrict abortion in the country. Now, mind you, Poland is one of the 3 European countries, alongside with Ireland and Malta, that has an almost total ban on abortion on demand and is generally not so keen in changing that anytime soon. Now, the law itself doesn't actually stand too much chances of being passed, I mean the legislative project, since not even the conservatives in the government are in favor of extending the restrictions too much further, and as far as I've been told by people more knowledgeable than me in Polish politics, it's not even a very popular initiative. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is that the pro-choice media, especially the English language media, is lying outright about the whole topic. For starters, they lay the blame for the project on the ruling party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, when in fact this idea did not come from the PIS cabinet, nor from PIS members of the parliament. Again, it's a citizens' initiative. The parliament is constitutionally mandated to discuss it. Now, I know that in the leftist mind, the law only matters when it favors the left or harms the right, and this is particularly true in the case of Polish leftists. But anyway, the law is what it is, and the parliament is abiding by it. Now, these facts did not stop the media from lying about it, nor from fully broadcasting the leftist hysteria that manifested itself on the streets of the Polish capital and other cities with sensationalist titles, as if a bunch of hysterical leftists are necessarily representative of the Polish society or even representative of those who disagree with the project. Of course, similarly sized demonstrations by the supporters of the law were conveniently left unbroadcasted because, well, we all know why that happened. And so this is the first reason why pro-choicers suck. They lie too much. That is to say, way too much. And it's the kind of lying that sticks and it stinks over time. Take this example from the BBC reporting on the hysteria, purporting to cite some Professor Romuald Dybski, who allegedly works at a hospital in Warsaw. Quote, "Whoever causes the death of the unborn child is punishable by imprisonment up to 3 years. If I have a patient with pre-eclampsia who is 32 weeks pregnant, I will have to let her and her child die. I have to, because if I perform a cesarean section and the child dies, I may go to prison for 3 years because the child was premature." Close quote. Now that is an outright fabrication. I mean, anyone mildly familiar with how any law sounds in a civil law country knows full well that a law is a collection of articles, not a story. And the format is usually like this. Article 1, the premise and the goal. Article 2, clear-cut exceptions from the above premise. Article 3, further clarification on what other exceptions can be admitted under certain conditions. Article 4, categories of people who are excluded or included in this law and the rationale for that said inclusion or exclusion. Now, admittedly, sometimes it's paragraphs underneath an article, but you get the point. Also, you will notice that there is no way to find the full actual text of the law anywhere in the media. You know, like a nice little PDF where which we can read and then make up our own minds. Now, luckily, I know a few people who speak Polish and told me these things because otherwise there is and there was no way to know. Politico.eu, of all places, is the only outlet in English that I was able to find that calls out the lie that I quoted from the BBC. Stating clearly that, quote, the bill would allow the termination of a pregnancy only in a case a woman's life is directly threatened, close quote, which is true. And it also incidentally contradicts one of the strongest emotional and appeal to authority points made by the BBC. Basically, the more pro-choicers lie, the more they will turn public opinion against them. You know, the anti-abortion crowd learned a few lessons in the last decade or so, lessons that the pro-abortion crowd seems to have forgotten. And yeah, let's cut to the chase here. There is no pro-choice or pro-life. I mean, everyone is pro-life to a certain extent, and everyone is pro-choice in another way. These euphemisms lower the level of honesty in the discussion. Now we're discussing abortion here. So let's use proper terminology. There are basically 3 groups of people, the pro-abortion being legal crowd, and the pro-abortion being illegal crowd. And then there is the third very small crowd, which is basically people like me who say that abortion is killing, but there are situations where it simply is the better alternative. It is nasty, it's messed up, it's definitely immoral, but life is hard and sometimes there aren't any moral choices, just various degrees of immoral choices. And this is basically the second reason why the pro-abortion crowd sucks. Euphemisms. You know, when I was in London in July, I met a Welsh chap who told me something that stuck with me. He told me something like this: "Mate, if you can defend abortion using only the proper terminology, that is, abortion and child murder, then I'm very happy to hear your argument. If you go into euphemisms, I'm not interested in listening to someone who is not even willing to be honest about what he's advocating." And mind you, this was a guy who thought that abortion should be legal, but with a lot more restrictions than the status quo, which, by the way, in Britain the status quo is horrible. But more on that in a minute. So, if you listen to or read most of the pro-abortion crowd, you'll notice that the word abortion very rarely emerges in the text, and terminology like child murder or killing never emerges. With the pro-abortion crowd, it's always safe services of pregnancy interruption or some nonsense like that. The problem is that some of these euphemisms are not even proper euphemisms but outright lies. I mean, the word interruption does imply that something was in progress and it was interrupted with a view to be continued sometime in the future. Now, I'm sorry, but that doesn't happen in the case of abortion. A more proper euphemism would be, or would have been, pregnancy suppression or pregnancy terminator. But then again, using an accurate description, even a euphemistic one, opens the advocate to questions that are very hard. Questions like, well, if it's a terminator, then what does it terminate? And why is it okay to terminate it? And that's how we come to the third reason why pro-choicers suck: obtuseness and unwilling to discuss policy. Now, I'm in the position where basically everyone hates me. The anti-abortion crowd is skeptical of me because I'm not anti-abortion enough, and the pro-abortion side absolutely hates me for daring to ask tough questions and undermine their cause. Oh, it's a nice spot to be in, really. The thing is that most of the pro-abortion crowd is unwilling to discuss policy, and some of that is due to the fact that their crowd has gotten very lazy and very disconnected from the realities of policy making. For instance, one uncomfortable question that I like to ask is, why shouldn't fathers have a say in the decision? Now, the usual response is, well, it's her body and therefore it's her choice, and sometimes even more impolite misandric implications of the sort and whatnot. And to that I usually reply with something like this: well, if a child is born, then the state will do everything in its power to hold the father financially accountable for the support of that child. Now that's fine, but if a man is forcibly made part of the results of the decision, then wouldn't it be equitable for him to also be made part of the decision itself? Why is it fair for the state to extract resources from him for 18 years, but not fair for the state to ask her to do 9 months of work? In other words, what makes her body for 9 months more special than his body for 18 years? Because last time I checked, men weren't collecting a paycheck from the patriarchy, but are actually using their bodies to generate resources. Now, needless to say, such a retort creates quite a lot of frustration and animosity to most pro-abortionists because they suddenly have to face their own biases and double standards, and nobody likes that. The sad part for them is that whatever they answer, they're wrong from a practical policy perspective. I mean, sure, intellectually speaking, the best answer to this is to say, look, legal paternal surrender should absolutely be a thing, choice for men is something I support, or something to that effect. Now that's all fine and dandy, but the problem is that such thing will most likely never happen for a variety of reasons, starting with the fact that a gynocentric society will never ever give a flying toss about men. I mean, choice for unwitting fathers is unlikely to ever become a thing during my lifetime or your lifetime, those of you watching this video. But a ban on abortion is a lot more likely to happen, so how do we reconcile these facts? Well, pro-choicers simply don't have an answer to that, and they genuinely believe that they can just get away with saying, well, I support legal paternal surrender, and then get back to advocating for full, unvetted, unlimited, taxpayer-funded abortion. Sorry kids, it doesn't work that way. Policy making is by definition a game of trade-offs. You have to give something in order to get something. Whenever you try to shortcut this aspect or impose trade-offs that are highly unbalanced, soon enough there will be trouble, disgruntlement, and before you know it, the law of unintended consequences hits you when you expect it the least. Here's some more example. An argument that I routinely use to poke holes in the pro-abortionists' policies is this one: the status quo in Britain. Now, in Great Britain, except for Northern Ireland, It is entirely possible and perfectly legal to have in the exact same hospitals doctors in one room working tirelessly with an increasing rate of success to save a child in the 6 months of pregnancy, and doctors in the next room working tirelessly with a criminal rate of success to kill a child in the 6th month of pregnancy. Now, how is that not murder? This line of reasoning is a very efficient way to separate the pro-abortionists that have a reasoned and pragmatic policy position from, well, the mental asylum. Now, the loudest pro-abortionists out there are from the mental asylum category, whilst the less militant ones are slightly more likely to be open to debate. Now again, I don't advise debating pro-abortionists unless you have an audience, otherwise it's not really worth the hassle. I'm laughing because without my intention this video is turning into a 5 ways to debate pro-abortionists, even though I swear this was not my intent. Anyway, the 4th reason why pro-choicers suck: character assassination. You know, I'm old enough to remember a time when this not-so-simple ethical question was discussed in terms of policy, starting from the common ground of absolute agreement that there should be as few abortions as possible. In other words, both the pro-choicers and the pro-lifers agreed beforehand that it is not a healthy way of doing things to have hundreds of thousands or millions of abortions each year. Do you remember the time when liberals purported to hold the political position that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare? Yeah, it kinda seems like ancient history now, doesn't it? These days there is the hashtag #ShoutYourAbortion movement, and the mainstream liberal argument is this, coming from The Guardian, quote, "There are no good abortions and bad abortions, because an abortion is just a medical procedure, reproductive healthcare is healthcare, and it is a fact without caveat that a fetus is not a person. I own my body and I decide what I allow to grow in it. Telling our stories at full volume chips away at stigma, at lies, at the climate of shame that destroys the lives, sometimes literally, of women and girls and anyone anywhere on the gender spectrum who can become pregnant, especially those living in poverty, in rural areas, and in hyper-religious and conservative households. It is vital to remember too that being able to tell my abortion story without feeling unsupported and unsafe, beyond the general unease of knowing my country is full of heavily armed anti-intellectual GOP wingnuts, is a privilege. I speak out because I can. There is a reason why hashtag #ShoutYourAbortion has been getting mountains of positive mainstream press attention, while the people terrorizing us, my feed is clogged with pictures of bloody fetuses and death threats, this is Twitter after all, are ignored on the fringe. It's because we are right, and however glacially society evolves, it is evolving in the right direction. Abortion is common, abortion is happening, abortion needs to be legal, safe, and accessible to everyone. Abortion is a thing you can say out loud. Now you tell me, how do you have a reasonable discussion with these people? Because from where I'm standing, there is none, and no attempt should even be made. We're no longer in the era of safe, legal, and rare, but in the era of safe, legal, paid for by the taxpayer, universally available, and common. And that is not an acceptable trade-off by any means. Also, you will notice the laziness that runs rampant on the pro-abortionist side. Just like with vaccines, the left is turning overwhelmingly anti-science and towards conspiratorial talk. In any event, the pro-choicers are so far left in so many cases that they've lost any ability to even attempt to defend their position without character assassination, or to even consider that their position might be improved or improvable. Again, back in the era of safe, legal, and rare, things like waiting periods, mandatory debriefing on what the procedure entails, just like it's the case with almost all elective surgeries after all, or allowing private sector services such as charities to offer alternatives, all of these were on the table, but not anymore. In France, there used to be an NGO who used to routinely offer to women or couples the option of adoption or the option of being taken care of and assisted throughout the child's first years in life. Sure, some women refused their help and that was fine, but many didn't, and ended up giving birth to very healthy, happy and beautiful children who grew up to be upstanding citizens of the Republic with the help of that particular organization. Not anymore. Their presence was banned from the premises of abortion clinics after left-wing activists complained that the NGO is too Christian and thus triggering. Now, the NGO itself wasn't actually religious, but that didn't matter. Character assassination was deployed because one of its members was religious, and thus that was simply enough. Now, this tactic may have worked so far, but with more and more excesses like these, the less it will work in the future. Besides, who says you have to be religious to be against abortion being taxpayer-funded, too common and too broadly allowed? I mean, Czech Republic, for instance, is a country that is 80% atheist or non-religious, yet only 49% of the populace believes that abortion is morally acceptable, according to a Pew Research study. In the same study, 66% of the Czechs believe that extramarital affairs are morally unacceptable. I mean, heck, Christopher Hitchens not only believed that there is such thing as the rights of unborn children, but also funded quite a few pro-life causes from his own pocket during his life. And you can say many things about the late Hitchens, but surely not that he was a religious bigot. Even the central hub of far-left edgy atheism, that would be pathos.com, still admitted in 2014 that there actually is a legitimate non-religious case against abortion and ran a piece about it. Robert M. Price, member of the advisory board of the Secular Student Alliance and author of books such as Jesus is Dead or The Case Against the Case for Christ, believes abortion is second-degree murder. And I could go on like this for an hour, but you get the point. Sooner or later, the slander, the character assassinations, and the utterly nonsensical and baseless allegations by the pro-abortionists of religious bigotry will lose their power. And once that happens, and it will happen even if it takes 50 years, as I was saying in the intro, a significant chunk of the unearned moral smugness on which the left stays on when it comes to this topic will crumble. And they're not prepared for that, nor will they be, because they suck. And finally, the fifth reason for which pro-choicers suck, the science denialism, particularly the clump of cells types of arguments. Again, when they want to virtue signal to their fellow edgy lefty friends, pro-abortionists frame the issue in terms like the following. Oh, the big bad religious bigots who are fighting for the rights of a clump of cells. Give me a break. Hue. Now, the thing is that the clump of cells description is outdated at best or ill-intended at worst. And to address the religious bigots part of the argument at the same time, let's read what Christopher Hitchens had to say about the clump of cells argument back in the days when Vanity Fair was printing actual discussion and not dudes in dresses. Quote, that the most partially formed human embryo is both human and alive has now been confirmed in an especially vivid sense by the new debate over stem cell research and the bioethics of cloning. If an ailing or elderly person can be granted a new lease on life by a transfusion of this cellular material, then it is obviously not random organic matter. The original embryonic blastocyst may be a clump of 64 to 200 cells that is only 5 days old, but all of us began our important careers in that form and every needful encoding for life is already present in the apparently inchoate. We are the first generation to have to confront this as a certain knowledge. By rightly expanding our definition of what is alive and what is human, we have also accepted that there may be a conflict of rights between a potential human and an actual one. The only moral losers in this argument are those who say that there is no conflict and nothing to argue about. The irresoluble conflict of right with the right was Hegel's definition of tragedy, and tragedy is inseparable from human life, and no advance in science or medicine is ever going to enable us to avoid that. Now, did you hear that, my fellow atheists? Claiming that there is no conflict in there and nothing to argue about when it comes to the personhood and the rights of a fetus is not a winning strategy. As science progresses, we're finding out quite the opposite, that there is a conflict and that there is quite a lot to argue about. And no amount of edgy hashtags on Twitter is going to change that. Alright, so, to sum up, I don't think there is a way to solve this anytime soon, but I do think that this will be solved by science regardless of the pro-choicers' opinions and regardless of anyone's opinions, really. The moral issue will be settled slowly but surely, and the rampant, vapid, militant pro-choicers are not going to like it. Because in the near future, the pro-choicers aren't going to battle religion, but they'll have to battle science itself, and that's usually a losing battle. This in fact follows the trends in other issues too, with leftists being the ones who generally refuse provenly effective vaccines, leftists being the only ones who still believe in the provenly false anthropocentric global warming fairy tale, leftists believing that one can change one's sex as if chromosomes are a right-wing conspiracy or something, and so on and so forth. Gallup polls show year after year that in the US, for instance, while the country is indeed getting less and less religious, it does get more and more pro-life. Now, good luck to the edgy lefty feminists on arguing with a big enough plurality of pro-life atheists. Virtually none of the tactics in the toolbox of the present-day pro-choice coalition work on these kind of people. And mind you, similar trends are occurring in Europe too, especially in the countries with way too unacceptable trade-offs like Britain or Sweden or Belgium. Ultimately, there are very few people who genuinely believe that all induced abortions need to be banned, as evidenced these days by the fact that even in Poland such a position is unpopular, even though most of the people protesting it are actually pro-life themselves, which is another aspect that the Cathedral media omitted from the picture. Links in the low bar for further clarification. In other words, there is no danger of completely irrational policy anywhere in Europe or North America. Meanwhile, there are too many jurisdictions and countries that absolutely have way too extreme policies on this topic. For instance, 8 US states have no limit on abortion, so basically abortion on demand in the 34th week is perfectly legal and fine and dandy. I'm sorry, but that's murder, and you don't have to be a Bible thumper to realize that. Heck, you don't even have to be a conservative. I mean, basic human decency should suffice. And again, the fact that it happens rarely doesn't change the fact that it's murder. Murder happens rarely too. Now, everything I said in this video is completely uncontroversial with the vast majority of people, but it is almost hate speech with the establishmentarian liberals, who are all, of course, about choice when it comes to killing your children, but then against choice on anything else, such as the choice to own guns, the choice to private or homeschooling, the choice to have my own healthcare plan, the choice to associate with whomever I want, and so on and so forth. Now, there are basically two ways this can go down. My preferred method is the one that I described earlier. The less insane sectors of the pro-choice camp, that is to say no feminists, no edgy idiots, no anti-science conspiracists, and generally none of the nastiness of the left, to come forward and start discussing policy based on objective facts and with less emotion. The anti-abortion camp is already willing to allow for exceptions and compromises, but the pro-abortion camp is unwilling to even consider that maybe, just maybe, having societies where abortion is common willy-nilly and paid for with money taken at gunpoint from unwilling people is probably not the fairest trade-off conceivable. That's why pro-choicers suck. Pro-choicers need to learn that there actually are things in life that are far more important than the feelings of irresponsible female feminists, and they will learn either the nice way or the hard way. Because the second way this can go down is through a steadily increase in frustration amongst the general public and the emergence of a genuinely nasty regime that will bring back the back alley abortions that the pro-choicers use now as a straw man to commit the false dichotomy fallacy. Actually, the back alley abortions were only common in Romania back in the days of the decree, yet the argument is used mostly by American pro-choicers who've managed to convince an entire generation that abortion never happened legally before Roe v. Wade, which, by the way, is a huge lie. But it is a false dichotomy nonetheless. There are more alternatives than Decree 770 on one end and Roe v. Wade as interpreted in DC or New Mexico, that is to say no limits on abortion whatsoever, on the other hand. The idea that these two are the only acceptable positions is very dangerous indeed, and if the pro-choicers continue with such excesses, they might end up polarizing the public to the opposite extreme, and then they'll learn the hard way. Now, I don't want that to happen, but pro-choicers aren't even willing to listen. Because they suck. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. Please direct all the hate in the comments below, and I guess I'll see some of you in Bucharest at the end of this week on the meet and greet. Talk to you soon on Freedom Alternative.